The music was too loud, and Lena Hart could not breathe. She pressed her back against the marble pillar and watched Daniel Voss push through the crowd of gowns and tuxedos, his eyes locked on her like she was something he owned. Her heart slammed against her ribs. She had told herself she was safe tonight. She had told herself a charity gala with 300 guests was the last place he would dare to corner her. She had been wrong. Lena. His voice cut through the chatter, smooth and calm, the way it always sounded right before something ugly happened. You look beautiful tonight. Come say hello properly. She did not move. Her fingers curled around the stem of an untouched champagne glass, knuckles white. 6 months. It had been 6 months since she walked out of his apartment with one suitcase and a promise to herself that she would never let him control another minute of her life. And yet here he was, closing the distance between them in that unhurried way of his, like a man who knew the room belonged to him. I have nothing to say to you, she managed. You always say that. He smiled, and it did not reach his eyes. And you always come back. Panic rose in her throat, hot and fast. The exit was 30 feet away, but Daniel's friend, a broad man in a black suit, had drifted toward the door, blocking her easiest path. She scanned the ballroom, desperate for a face she recognized. A security guard. Anyone. Instead, her eyes landed on a man standing alone near the tall windows, a glass of dark liquor untouched in his hand, watching the room the way a general watches a battlefield he already knows he has won. She did not know his name. She only knew that every person who passed him lowered their voice, and every woman who looked at him looked away just as fast, as if drawn to something they were afraid to want. He was tall, dressed in black, with a jaw that looked like it had never once softened for anyone. There was a stillness to him that made the noise of the party seem to fall back a step. Daniel's hand closed around her wrist. It was not hard. It was not violent. It was the same grip he had used 100 times before, gentle enough to look harmless to anyone watching, tight enough to remind her exactly who was in control. Old fear rushed through her body like ice water. Let go of me, she whispered. We're going to have a conversation, Daniel said pleasantly, already turning her toward the terrace doors. Just a small one, like old times. Lena's mind went blank with terror, and then, in the space of a single heartbeat, it went sharp and clear instead. She twisted her wrist free, stumbled 2 steps sideways, and did the only thing she could think to do. She walked straight up to the stranger by the window, and slipped her arm through his, pressing close against his side, as though she had known him for years. Please, she breathed, so quietly only he could hear it. Play along. Just for tonight. I am begging you. For one endless second, he said nothing. His dark eyes moved from her face to the man now standing several feet behind her, jaw tight, confusion flickering across his features. Something unreadable passed behind the stranger's gaze. Calculation, maybe amusement, maybe something colder. Then he set his glass down on the windowsill without hurrying, slid his arm around her waist as if it belonged there, and looked directly at Daniel Voss with an expression that made the temperature in the room seem to drop. Is there a problem here? The stranger asked. His voice was low, unbothered, the kind of voice that did not need to be raised to make people listen. Daniel's jaw tightened. This doesn't concern you. She's my fiancée. The words came out easy, unhurried, like he had said them 1,000 times before. So I'm afraid it does. The silence that followed felt enormous. Lena's pulse pounded in her ears. She felt the stranger's arm tighten slightly at her waist. A silent signal. Stay calm. Let me handle this. Daniel's eyes flicked between them, searching for the lie, finding none in the stranger's flat, immovable stare. Fiancé, Daniel repeated, his mouth twisting into something between a laugh and a sneer. Since when? Since it stopped being any of your business, the stranger said. Now I suggest you find your friend by the door and enjoy the rest of your evening somewhere far away from mine. There was a beat where Lena thought Daniel might push further, might grab for her again, might do something reckless in front of all these important people. But whatever he saw in the stranger's face made him hesitate. His eyes swept over the tailored black suit, the easy authority in his stance, the quiet way 3 separate people in the crowd had already noticed him and adjusted their path to avoid getting too close. Recognition dawned, slow and unwelcome, on Daniel's face. Ronan Cole, he said under his breath, like the name itself was a threat. The stranger, Ronan, did not confirm or deny it. He simply raised one eyebrow, unimpressed, and waited. Daniel's jaw worked for a moment. Then, with the practiced smoothness of a man who hated losing but knew how to hide it, he stepped back, straightened his jacket, and offered a thin smile. "Congratulations," he said, voice dripping with something poisonous beneath the polite words. "I hope you know what you're getting into." His eyes cut to Lena one last time, cold and promising. "We'll talk soon, Lena." He walked away without waiting for a response, disappearing into the crowd with his friend trailing behind him. The moment he was gone, Lena's knees nearly buckled. She had been holding herself together through sheer will, and now that the threat had stepped back, the fear came rushing out of her all at once, in a shaking breath she could not quite control. Ronan's grip on her waist steadied her without letting go. "Breathe," he said quietly, no longer performing for an audience. "He's gone." "I'm sorry," she said, pulling back slightly, humiliation creeping in now that the danger had passed. "I shouldn't have. I panicked. I didn't know what else to do." "You made a decision under pressure," Ronan said, studying her the way a man studies a puzzle he has not yet decided whether he wants to solve. "That's not something to apologize for." Up close, she could see that his eyes were a deep, unreadable brown, and there was a stillness in them that unsettled her more than Daniel's cold smile ever had. He did not look at her with pity, and he did not look at her with concern exactly. He looked at her like he was recalculating something, adjusting a plan she could not see. "Thank you," she said, straightening her spine, trying to reclaim some dignity. "For playing along. I'll go now. I'm sorry to have involved you." She started to step back, but his hand remained lightly at her elbow, not gripping, just present, just enough to make her pause. "You called me your fiancé in front of half the business elite of this city," he said. "Word travels fast in rooms like this. If you walk away right now, in 10 minutes everyone here will know it was a lie, and your friend will know it too. Is that what you want?" Lena's stomach dropped. He was right. She had seen the way people watched them, whispered behind raised glasses, already reaching for their phones. If the story fell apart within the hour, Daniel would know exactly how afraid she still was, and worse, he would know she had no one standing beside her, no protection, nothing but her own 2 hands, and a stolen moment of borrowed courage. "What do you suggest?" she asked carefully. "We finish the night," Ronan said. "You stay at my side. We let people believe what they already believe. It costs you nothing." "And costs you what?" she asked, wary. Men like him did not do anything for free. She had learned that lesson at great cost already. For the first time, something like the ghost of a smile touched the corner of his mouth. "Let's discuss that later. Right now, smile. There's a woman in blue 3 tables away who has not stopped watching us since the moment you took my arm, and she happens to run the largest gossip column in this city." Lena let out a breath that was almost a laugh, startled by how easily he had read the room, how unbothered he seemed by all of it. She straightened, forced her shoulders back, and let him guide her deeper into the party, one hand resting lightly against the small of her back, as though they truly did belong together. For the rest of the evening, she watched him work the room the way other men worked a chessboard, 3 moves ahead, never rushed, never uncertain. He introduced her by name only, no explanations offered, no details given, and somehow that restraint made the lie feel more solid than any elaborate story could have. People did not question a man who did not need to convince them of anything. She learned little pieces of him without meaning to, that other executives greeted him with a careful respect that bordered on wariness, that the mention of his company name made several conversations shift subjects entirely, that once, when a photographer leaned in too close with a camera, Ronan's assistant appeared from nowhere and quietly redirected the man before Lena even registered what was happening. By the time the gala began to wind down, her fear of Daniel had dulled into something more manageable, tucked away behind the strange, disorienting comfort of standing beside a man who seemed entirely unafraid of anything. Near the coat check, as she reached for her own wrap, Ronan spoke again, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "We should talk, somewhere quieter than this." "I think you've already done more than enough tonight," Lena said, guilt creeping back in, now that the adrenaline had faded. "I don't want to take up more of your evening." "You didn't take anything," Ronan said. "You handed me an opportunity. I don't often get those." His eyes held hers, steady and unreadable. 5 minutes. That's all I'm asking. Lena hesitated. Every instinct she had built over the last 6 months told her to run, to disappear into a cab and never think about tonight again. But there was something in the calm certainty of his voice that made her curious despite herself, a feeling she had not let herself trust in a very long time. 5 minutes, she agreed. He led her toward a quiet alcove near the emptying cloakroom, away from the last stragglers of the party, away from Daniel's suspicious eyes, should he still be lingering somewhere in the crowd. The noise of the gala faded into a low hum behind them. Ronan turned to face her fully for the first time all evening, and for a moment, Lena felt like she was being studied by someone who missed nothing. "That man tonight," he said. "He's not going to stop, is he?" The question landed harder than she expected. She looked away, jaw tight. "No, he's not." "I saw the way he grabbed your wrist," Ronan continued, his voice carefully even, though something dangerous moved beneath it. "That wasn't the first time." Lena said nothing, which was answer enough. Ronan nodded slowly, as though confirming something he had already suspected. "I have a proposal for you, Lena Hart, and I think, if you're smart, you'll hear me out before you say no." Her chest tightened with a mixture of dread and reluctant hope. "What kind of proposal?" He studied her for a long moment, the noise of the gala fading further into the background, the city lights glittering faintly through the tall windows behind him. "The kind," he said quietly, "that could make tonight's lie a very useful truth." Lena's heart pounded, uncertain whether she was about to walk into her salvation or straight into a different kind of danger entirely. But something about the steadiness in his eyes made her stay rooted to the spot, waiting to hear exactly what the alpha king of the city's business world was about to offer her. Lena stood very still in the quiet alcove, the noise of the gala rolling on behind her like a tide she had already stepped out of. Ronan Cole watched her with the patience of a man who had never once needed to convince anyone of anything, and that patience unsettled her more than any pressure could have. "I'm listening," she said finally, though her voice came out smaller than she wanted it to. "You need protection from that man," Ronan said. "Real protection. Not a lie that lasts one evening and falls apart the moment he corners you again in a parking lot or outside your apartment." His eyes did not waver from hers. "I can offer you that." "Why would you?" Lena asked, arms crossing over her chest, an old habit of guarding herself that she could not seem to break. "You don't know me. You don't owe me anything. Whatever you think you saw tonight, I don't need charity." "I'm not offering charity," Ronan said, and something in his tone made it clear he found the idea faintly insulting. "I run a company that several people would very much like to see fail. My board has been pressing me for months to prove I have a personal life stable enough to match the image we present to investors. A sudden engagement, a quiet wedding, a wife standing beside me at the right dinners. It would silence a great deal of noise I'd rather not deal with." Lena blinked, caught off guard by how plainly he laid it out. No softness, no attempt to make it sound romantic. "You want to use me." "I want to use each other," Ronan corrected. "You need a shield against a man who does not respect boundaries. I need a shield against a board that does not respect results unless they come wrapped in a stable public image. 30 days. A marriage on paper. Nothing more expected of you than to exist beside me at a handful of events. In exchange, you get my name, my resources, and enough protection that your Daniel Voss will think twice before he comes near you again." 30 days, Lena repeated slowly, testing the shape of the offer. "And then what?" "Then we part ways, cleanly, with a settlement generous enough that you never have to worry about him having power over you again." Ronan's expression did not change, calm and businesslike, as though he were negotiating a merger rather than a marriage. "You would want for nothing during that time. A place to live, complete security, and my name attached to yours, in every legal sense that matters." It should have felt insulting, the coldness of it, the transactional weight of his words, and yet Lena found herself turning the offer over in her mind, with something closer to relief than anger. She had spent 6 months looking over her shoulder, changing her route home twice a week, flinching at every unexpected knock on her door. Daniel had money, connections, and a family name that made most lawyers hesitate to take her case seriously. She had none of that. She had exhaustion, and a locked apartment door that did not feel like enough anymore. "What would you need from me?" she asked carefully. "Besides standing next to you at dinners." "Discretion," Ronan said. and the appearance of genuine affection when it matters. Nothing more. And if I say no, then I wish you luck, he said simply. And I mean that. But I don't think you came to that window tonight because you had a better option waiting in your pocket. The blunt honesty of it stung, mostly because it was true. Lena exhaled slowly, glancing past him toward the ballroom, where the last of the guests were trickling out into the night. Somewhere out there, Daniel was likely still waiting, patient the way predators were patient, certain that eventually she would run out of places to hide. I need to think, she said. You have until tomorrow morning, Ronan said. After that, the offer no longer makes sense. My assistant will need time to prepare the paperwork before the story of tonight's engagement spreads any further than it already has. He handed her a plain card, nothing but a phone number printed in small black text, no name, no company logo. She turned it over in her fingers, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on her chest. Why me? She asked quietly. Out of everyone in that room, why say yes when I grabbed your arm? For the first time all evening, something shifted behind Ronan's eyes, a flicker of something unreadable, gone as quickly as it appeared. Because you didn't ask me to save you, he said. You asked me to help you save yourself. There's a difference. I respect it. He left her standing there in the quiet alcove, disappearing back into the thinning crowd without another word, as unhurried leaving as he had been staying. Lena stood alone for a long moment, the card cool against her palm, her mind spinning through every possible outcome of the offer she had just been given. She did not sleep that night. She lay awake in her small apartment, the deadbolt locked, the chair wedged beneath the door handle out of habit more than necessity, replaying the calm authority in Ronan Cole's voice, the way Daniel had backed down the moment that name left his mouth. By morning, she had made her decision, not out of romance or hope, but out of the simple, exhausted need to finally feel safe. She called the number on the card at 7 in the morning. A woman answered, brisk and professional. Mr. Cole's office. This is Lena Hart, she said, her voice steadier than she expected. Tell him I accept. There was a brief pause, the sound of typing in the background. He'll be pleased to hear it. A car will collect you within the hour. Please have identification and any relevant documents ready. The call ended before Lena could ask a single question, and within the hour, exactly as promised, a black car was waiting outside her apartment building, sleek and silent, a driver, holding the door open with the same quiet efficiency she had noticed in everyone who worked around Ronan Cole. The ride took her across the city, past the modest neighborhoods she knew, into the gleaming glass towers she had only ever seen from a distance. The car stopped outside the tallest of them, a building that seemed to swallow the sky, its entrance flanked by security guards who nodded the driver through without a word. Inside, a private elevator carried her up in silence, the city shrinking beneath her with every passing floor, until the doors opened directly into a penthouse office, where Ronan Cole stood waiting by a wall of windows, the same stillness about him that had first caught her attention the night before. You came, he said, not quite a question. I said I would, Lena replied, setting her small bag down on the nearest chair, trying to project a confidence she did not entirely feel. A woman with sharp eyes and a tablet in hand stepped forward, introduced simply as his lawyer, and within 20 minutes, Lena found herself seated across a glass table, reading through a contract more thorough than she had expected, every detail accounted for, every protection spelled out in careful legal language. 30 days of marriage, full legal protection against any action Daniel Voss might attempt, housing, security, and a settlement at the end that would allow her to rebuild her life entirely on her own terms. You've thought of everything, she murmured, scanning the final page. I don't leave room for surprises, Ronan said from where he stood near the window, arms crossed, watching her read with the patience of a man who already knew what her answer would be. She signed her name at the bottom of the final page, her hand steadier than she expected it to be, and something in the room shifted the moment the pen left the paper, as though a door had quietly closed behind her, and another had opened somewhere ahead, leading toward a future she could not yet see the shape of. Congratulations, the lawyer said dryly, gathering the papers. You're getting married on Thursday. Lena's stomach dropped at the speed of it. 3 days. Barely enough time to process what she had just agreed to, let alone prepare for it. Thursday, she repeated. The board meets Friday morning, Ronan said, as though that explained everything, which, in his world, it apparently did. It's best if the news is already settled fact by then. And where exactly will I be living during these 30 days? Lena asked, trying to keep pace with how quickly her life was being rearranged around her. With me, Ronan said simply. A marriage that looks real requires a shared address. My staff will help you move whatever you need by tomorrow evening. Lena opened her mouth to argue, some instinct rebelling against the idea of sharing a home with a man she had known for less than a day, but the memory of Daniel's grip on her wrist rose up sharp and immediate, silencing the protest before it fully formed. A temporary marriage to a stranger, however strange it felt, was still infinitely safer than the alternative she had been living with for the past 6 months. Fine, she said quietly. Thursday then. Ronan studied her for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his dark eyes, before he gave a single, decisive nod, as though the matter were already settled in his mind, the way every decision in his life seemed to be, swift, calculated, and final. Welcome to the arrangement, Mrs. Cole, he said, and though his voice carried no particular warmth, something in the way he said it made Lena's pulse stir in a way she did not fully understand, and did not yet trust herself to examine too closely. The wedding took place on Thursday afternoon in a small private room on the top floor of the Cole building, sunlight pouring through floor-to-ceiling windows onto a handful of guests who all seemed to know exactly how unusual the occasion was, and none of them said a single word about it. Lena wore a simple pale dress, chosen by a stylist she had met only that morning, her hands trembling slightly, as she repeated vows to a man she had known for exactly 4 days. Ronan's voice, when he spoke his own vows, was steady and certain, giving nothing away, and Lena found herself grateful for that steadiness, borrowing some of it for herself, as she stood in front of strangers pretending this was the beginning of something real. By evening she was standing in the entrance of his penthouse, suitcase in hand, staring up at ceilings so high they seemed to disappear into shadow, at furniture so expensive she was afraid to sit on it, at a view of the city that stretched endlessly beneath the wide windows like a map of lights. This is a lot of space for 2 people, she said, trying to make light of the silence pressing in around her. You'll have the east wing, Ronan said, already halfway across the room, his attention pulled toward a stack of documents waiting on a side table, the habits of a man whose work never truly stopped. Clara will show you around. She manages the household. As if summoned, a warm-faced woman in her 50s appeared from a side hallway, her expression kind in a way that immediately put Lena slightly more at ease than anything else in the apartment had managed to. Mrs. Cole, Clara said, and Lena flinched slightly at the name, still unfamiliar on her ears. Let me show you to your rooms. You must be exhausted. The east wing, as it turned out, was nearly the size of Lena's entire previous apartment, a bedroom with a private sitting area, a bathroom larger than her old kitchen, and a closet already stocked with clothing, in her exact size, tags still attached, waiting for her, as though she had always been expected to arrive. He had this all arranged? Lena asked, running her fingers over a soft gray sweater she would never have been able to afford on her own. Mr. Cole does not do anything halfway, Clara said, a faint smile tugging at her mouth. You'll learn that soon enough. That first night, Lena lay awake in the enormous unfamiliar bed, staring at a ceiling she could barely see in the darkness, listening to sounds of a home that was not truly hers. Footsteps somewhere on a lower floor, the faint hum of the city far below the windows. She thought of Daniel, wondered if he had already heard the news, wondered how long it would take before he tried something reckless in response. She thought of Ronan, sitting somewhere in that vast apartment with his stack of papers, married to a stranger for reasons that had nothing to do with affection, and everything to do with strategy. She did not expect to fall asleep, but exhaustion eventually won out over anxiety, and the next morning she woke to sunlight streaming through unfamiliar curtains, and the quiet, disorienting realization that she was, in every legal sense, now a married woman. Over the following days, Lena began to learn the rhythms of a life she had never imagined for herself. Breakfast was usually a quiet affair, Ronan already dressed and reading through reports on a tablet propped against his coffee cup, offering brief, polite conversation, before disappearing into his study, or leaving for the office entirely. Clara ran the household with quiet efficiency, and a woman named Sophie Lang, Ronan's personal assistant, seemed to manage his entire professional life with the same calm precision, appearing at odd hours to hand him folders or remind him of appointments before vanishing again just as quickly. "Does he ever slow down?" Lena asked Sophie one afternoon, watching Ronan's car pull away from the building for the third meeting of the day. Sophie considered the question seriously, as though it deserved real thought. "Not that I've seen, not in 3 years of working for him." She hesitated, then added, almost carefully, "He works like a man trying to outrun something. I've never figured out what." The comment lingered in Lena's mind longer than she expected. There was something about Ronan Cole that did not fit the cold, calculating reputation the city had given him. Small inconsistencies she kept noticing despite herself. The way he had quietly instructed his driver to take a longer route home one evening, after noticing Lena flinch at a car that resembled Daniel's. The way he had corrected a business partner sharply, almost protectively, when the man made an offhand comment about Lena's background during a dinner meeting she had been required to attend. It was during that same dinner, 3 days after the wedding, that Lena first saw a crack in his careful composure. The partner, an older man named Owen Blake, had leaned across the table with a patronizing smile and asked Lena what exactly qualified her to stand beside a man like Ronan Cole, as though her presence needed justifying to anyone at all. Lena had opened her mouth to respond with something polite and deflecting, years of practice smoothing over insults she had learned to swallow. But Ronan spoke first, his voice carrying none of its usual careful neutrality. "She doesn't need to answer that," he said, setting down his glass with more force than necessary. "And you don't get to ask it again." The table had gone quiet. Owen Blake had mumbled an apology and changed the subject swiftly, and Lena had sat there, stunned, staring at the side of Ronan's face, as he calmly resumed eating, as though nothing unusual had happened at all. Later that night, walking back to the penthouse elevator together, she finally asked him about it. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "Do what?" "Defend me. It's not part of the contract." Ronan glanced sideways at her, something flickering behind his eyes that she could not quite name. "Some things don't need to be written into a contract to matter," he said. And then, before she could respond, the elevator doors opened and he stepped through them, leaving her standing there with far more questions than she had walked in with. It was 2 nights after the dinner with Owen Blake that Lena twisted her ankle badly on the penthouse's private terrace, misjudging a step in the dim evening light while retrieving a book she had left outside. She bit back a cry of pain, gripping the railing, furious at her own clumsiness, when Ronan appeared beside her almost instantly, his hand steady beneath her elbow before she even registered he had left his study. "Don't put weight on it," he said, already crouching to examine her ankle, with a directness that left no room for her usual instinct to insist she was fine. "It's nothing," she protested weakly, though the throbbing pain suggested otherwise. "It's swelling," he said flatly, and before she could argue further, he had lifted her carefully, one arm beneath her knees, carrying her inside, as though she weighed nothing at all, settling her onto the sitting room sofa, with a gentleness that felt entirely at odds with the cold, commanding reputation the rest of the city seemed to fear. He returned moments later, with ice wrapped carefully in a cloth, kneeling in front of her to press it gently against the swollen joint, his touch far more careful than she expected from hands that closed multi-million-dollar deals without hesitation. "You didn't need to do this yourself," Lena said quietly, watching him work. "You could have called Clara." "Clara's off for the evening," Ronan said, not looking up, "and I was closer." The silence between them stretched, filled only with the faint hum of the city outside the windows, and the quiet rhythm of his hands, adjusting the ice against her ankle with careful precision. Lena studied his face in the low light, the sharp line of his jaw, the small furrow of concentration between his brows, and felt something shift uncomfortably in her chest, a warmth she had not invited, and was not entirely sure she wanted. "Thank you," she said softly. Ronan glanced up at her then, and for one unguarded moment, something raw passed behind his dark eyes, gone almost as quickly as it appeared, replaced by his usual careful composure. "You're welcome," he said, standing abruptly, putting distance between them with the same swift efficiency he applied to everything else in his life. But Lena had seen it, that flicker of something real beneath the ice, and long after he had disappeared back into his study, she sat on the sofa with her ankle propped on a pillow, staring at the door he had vanished through. wondering exactly how many more cracks she would find in the careful armor of the Alpha King before one of them finally broke all the way through. By the second week of the marriage, Lena had stopped counting the days out of nervousness and started counting them out of something closer to reluctant comfort, a routine forming around a life that still did not feel entirely her own. Her ankle healed within days, but the memory of Ronan's careful hands pressing ice against her skin lingered longer than the injury itself, resurfacing at odd moments, during quiet breakfasts, during the drive to yet another dinner she was required to attend at his side. She was setting the table for a rare evening, when both of them happened to be home before 9, Clara having left early for her sister's birthday, when her phone buzzed against the counter. She glanced at the screen and felt her stomach drop. An unknown number, a single message. "You look happy in the photos from the wedding. Let's see how long that lasts." Her hands went cold around the phone. She knew, without needing confirmation, exactly who had sent it. Lena? She looked up to find Ronan standing in the doorway, his jacket already removed, sleeves rolled to the forearm, watching her with the sharp attentiveness of a man who missed very little. She hesitated only a moment before handing him the phone, some instinct telling her that hiding it would only make things worse, that whatever fragile trust was building between them deserved more than silence. Ronan read the message twice, his expression darkening in a way she had not yet seen, something colder and more controlled than anger, something far more dangerous. "He's escalating," Ronan said quietly. "I don't understand how he even got this number," Lena said, her voice tight with frustration and old fear. "I changed it before the wedding." "Then he has resources beyond what I initially accounted for," Ronan said, already moving toward his study, phone in hand, dialing before he had even fully crossed the room. Lena followed, standing in the doorway as he spoke in clipped, efficient sentences to someone on the other end, arranging additional security measures, tracing the number, tightening protocols around the building she had only just begun to think of as home. When he finally ended the call, he turned back to her, his expression unreadable, but his voice steady. "You'll have a security escort from now on, even for short trips. I should have arranged it from the beginning. This isn't your responsibility to fix," Lena said, though the words felt hollow, even as she said them, given the very contract she had signed specifically because she needed exactly this kind of protection. "It became my responsibility the moment you took my arm at that gala," Ronan said. "I don't make commitments I don't intend to keep, Lena, even the ones that started as convenient arrangements." Something in the way he said her name, without the usual clipped formality, made her chest tighten unexpectedly. She opened her mouth to respond, unsure what she even wanted to say, when his own phone rang, the screen displaying a name she did not recognize, Victor Sinclair. Ronan's jaw tensed almost imperceptibly before he answered, his tone shifting instantly into something colder, more guarded than anything he had used with her. "Victor." Lena watched his expression carefully as the conversation unfolded, catching only fragments, references to a merger, to board seats, to numbers she did not fully understand. But she noticed the way Ronan's shoulders squared, the way his free hand curled into a fist at his side despite the calm in his voice. When the call ended, he stood in silence for a long moment before finally turning back to her. "Who is Victor Sinclair?" she asked. "A rival," Ronan said simply. "One who has spent the last 2 years trying to acquire enough shares to force his way onto my board. He's been circling for months, waiting for any weakness he can exploit." "And does our marriage count as a weakness or a strength in his eyes?" Lena asked, an uneasy feeling settling low in her stomach. Ronan's eyes met hers, something calculating flickering behind them. "That depends entirely on how convincing we are," he said. The following evening, at a private dinner hosted by one of Ronan's longtime business associates, Lena found herself seated across from Victor Sinclair for the first time. A lean, sharply dressed man with a smile too polished to be trusted, and eyes that studied her like she was a puzzle he intended to solve. "Lena Hart," Victor said, swirling the wine in his glass thoughtfully. "Or should I say Cole now? I must admit, the sudden engagement caught quite a few people off guard." "Life is full of surprises," Lena said carefully, aware of Ronan's steady presence beside her, though he remained quiet, watching the exchange unfold with the patience of a predator, waiting to see which direction the conversation would move. "It certainly is," Victor agreed, his smile widening slightly. "Tell me, Lena, Does the name Whitmore mean anything to you? The question landed like a stone dropped into still water. Lena felt her expression falter for half a second, before she caught herself, but it was enough time for Victor's smile to sharpen with satisfaction, and enough time for Ronan's attention beside her to go entirely still. I don't know what you mean, Lena said, though her voice wavered slightly. No? Victor tilted his head, feigning surprise poorly. Interesting. Your mother's maiden name, if I'm not mistaken. The Whitmore family holdings were rather significant once, before they quietly dissolved into obscurity. I only mention it because certain parties have taken quite an interest in tracing exactly where those assets ended up. I think that's enough for tonight, Victor, Ronan said, his voice deceptively calm, though Lena could feel the tension radiating from him like heat from a closed furnace. Victor raised his hands in mock surrender, that same thin smile never wavering. Of course. Just making conversation. Congratulations again, to you both. He rose from the table, offering a small, mocking bow before making his way toward another group of guests, leaving a heavy silence in his wake. Lena sat frozen, her mind spinning. Her mother had died when she was young, and the little Lena knew of her mother's family had always been vague, fragmented stories about a falling out long before Lena was born, a name rarely spoken in her childhood home. She had never once considered that her mother's family might have left behind anything of value, let alone something worth Victor Sinclair's calculated attention. Lena, Ronan said quietly, once they were finally alone in the car afterward, city lights sliding past the tinted windows. What do you know about the Whitmore family? Almost nothing, Lena admitted, staring at her hands in her lap. My mother never talked about them. I always assumed it wasn't important. It's important now, Ronan said grimly. If Victor is digging into your family history, it's because he believes there's something there worth finding, something he can use as leverage, either against you directly, or against me through you. Against me how? Lena asked, unease creeping through her chest. Ronan's expression darkened further. If there's an inheritance tied to your mother's family that was never claimed, and if Daniel Voss somehow knew about it before you did, it would explain quite a lot about why a man like him fought so hard to keep you close for as long as he did. The realization settled over Lena like a physical weight, cold and disorienting. Every controlling moment, every manipulation, every carefully engineered argument that had kept her tethered to Daniel for 2 miserable years suddenly took on a different shape entirely, no longer simply the actions of a jealous, controlling man, but potentially the calculated moves of someone chasing something far more valuable than her affection. He never loved me at all, she said quietly, more to herself than to Ronan, the words tasting bitter and strange on her tongue. Ronan was silent for a long moment, watching her carefully in the dim light of the car. Whatever his reasons were, he said finally, they end now. I'll have my legal team look into the Whitmore holdings quietly, before Victor or Daniel can use whatever they find against either of us. Lena looked over at him, searching his face for the calculation she expected to find, the same cold strategy that had defined every other decision he had made since the night they met. Instead, she found something steadier, something that looked almost like genuine concern beneath the composed exterior he wore like armor. Why does this matter to you? She asked softly. The contract only requires you to protect me from Daniel. This is something else entirely. Ronan held her gaze for a long moment before answering, his voice quieter than she had ever heard it. Because somewhere between that gala and tonight, he said, this stopped feeling like just a contract to me. The words hung in the space between them, heavier than either of them seemed prepared for, and Lena found she had no response ready at all, only the quiet, unsettling awareness that the carefully constructed boundaries of their arrangement were beginning to blur in ways neither of them had planned for. The legal team Ronan assigned to research the Whitmore family took only 4 days to uncover what Lena's mother had spent a lifetime keeping buried. A trust, established 2 generations back, tied to a small but valuable string of properties and mineral rights in the northern part of the state, left dormant and unclaimed, after a falling out between siblings that had scattered the family before Lena was even born. Her mother had walked away from it entirely, choosing a quiet, ordinary life over old family disputes she never wanted her daughter dragged into. It's worth more than either of us expected, Ronan said, sliding a folder across the glass table of his study, his expression unreadable, as Lena scanned the documents with growing disbelief. Enough that Victor Sinclair would very much like to see it fall into hands he can influence. And Daniel, Lena said quietly, piecing it together as she read. He must have found out somehow before I did. It would explain a great deal, Ronan agreed. A controlling relationship is far easier to justify to yourself if you believe the person you're controlling is sitting on assets worth claiming eventually. The thought made Lena's stomach turn. 2 years of her life recontextualized in an instant. Every anniversary, every apology, every moment she had once mistaken for love, reshaped into something calculated and cold. She set the folder down, unable to look at it any longer. I don't want it, she said abruptly. Ronan glanced up, surprised. The inheritance? Any of it, Lena said. If claiming it means dragging myself further into whatever war you and Victor and Daniel are all fighting, I would rather walk away and let it rot in some dusty legal file forever. That's not entirely your choice to make now, Ronan said gently, though there was no judgment in his tone, only quiet honesty. Victor already knows it exists. Whether you claim it or not, he'll continue circling, hoping to use the uncertainty against us regardless. Lena pressed her fingers against her temples, exhaustion settling deep into her bones. Then what do we do? We claim it first, Ronan said simply, on our terms, quietly, with protections in place that keep both Victor and Daniel from ever being able to touch it. My legal team can have the paperwork filed within the week. And in exchange? Lena asked, an old habit of expecting a price for everything rising instinctively to the surface. Something flickered across Ronan's face, something that looked almost like hurt, quickly smoothed away. In exchange, nothing, he said quietly. This has stopped being about the contract for me, Lena. I thought I made that clear the other night. The words settled uncomfortably between them, neither of them quite willing to examine the shift that had been happening slowly over the past 2 weeks, small moments accumulating into something neither of them had planned or fully understood. Lena looked away first, unsettled by the intensity in his gaze, by the warmth that had begun creeping into her own chest whenever he looked at her like that. That evening, at a smaller, quieter dinner hosted at the penthouse itself rather than some public venue, Lena found herself relaxing in a way she had not expected. Clara had prepared a simple meal, insisting the newlyweds deserved at least one evening without cameras or business associates watching their every move. And for the first time since the wedding, Lena felt something like the ordinary rhythm of a real relationship settling around them. Tell me something true, she said, emboldened by the wine and the unusual quiet of the evening. Something that has nothing to do with the company or the contract. Ronan considered the request for a long moment, turning his glass slowly between his fingers. I grew up in a house where affection was treated like a weakness, he said finally. My father built an empire by trusting no one completely, and he made sure I understood that lesson before I was old enough to understand much else. I've spent most of my life running the company the same way, treating relationships as calculated risks rather than anything worth investing in for their own sake. That sounds lonely, Lena said softly. It was efficient, Ronan corrected, though something in his voice suggested he knew the two were not mutually exclusive. I hadn't thought of it as lonely until recently. Recently, meaning? His eyes met hers across the table, steady and unguarded in a way she had rarely seen from him. Meaning since a woman grabbed my arm at a gala and asked me to pretend to be someone I never expected to become. Lena's breath caught slightly, warmth spreading through her chest, despite every instinct telling her to guard against exactly this kind of moment. Ronan, she started, unsure what she even meant to say next. He set his glass down and reached across the table, his hand covering hers gently, a small gesture that somehow felt larger than anything else that had passed between them since the wedding. I know this began as an arrangement, he said quietly. I know the terms were clear from the start, but I find myself no longer entirely certain I want it to end in 30 days. The confession hung in the air between them, fragile and unexpected, and Lena felt her carefully constructed defenses waver dangerously. Every instinct she had built over the past 6 months warned her against trusting this kind of moment, against believing that a man who had once described their marriage purely in terms of strategy and protection could possibly mean the words he was saying now. And yet, when he leaned forward slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, she found she did not want to. The kiss was soft at first, careful, as though he were testing the boundaries of something neither of them had planned for, and then it deepened, warm and certain, chasing away weeks of guardedness, in a way that left Lena breathless when they finally broke apart. "I shouldn't have done that," Ronan said quietly, though he did not look away, did not retreat behind his usual careful composure. "Why not?" Lena asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because I'm not entirely sure I can promise you it means nothing," he said. "And I made you a contract, not a courtship." Lena studied his face for a long moment. The vulnerability there, so unlike the cold, commanding reputation the rest of the city had given him. "Maybe," she said slowly, testing the words as she spoke them. "The contract isn't the only thing between us anymore." Something shifted in his expression. Relief and hope tangled together beneath the careful mask he had worn since the night they met. He reached up, brushing a strand of hair back from her face with a gentleness that contradicted everything she had once believed about the man the city called the Alpha King. But even as the warmth of the moment settled around them, Lena's phone buzzed once more on the table beside her, and the name on the screen sent a familiar chill through her chest, shattering the fragile peace they had only just begun to build. Daniel Voss. Calling, not texting, for the first time since the wedding. Ronan's expression hardened instantly, the softness of moments before replaced by the sharp, protective focus she had come to recognize whenever any threat to her safety arose. "Don't answer it," he said quietly. But Lena, staring at the screen, felt a strange, steadying resolve settle over her instead. The same resolve that had once pushed her to grab a stranger's arm at a gala, rather than run blindly into the night. "No," she said, reaching for the phone. "This time, I think it's time he hears exactly how much has changed." Lena answered the call with her thumb trembling only slightly, Ronan watching from across the table with the tense stillness of a man ready to intervene the moment it became necessary. "Lena," Daniel's voice came through smooth and familiar, the tone he always used when he wanted something, patient, almost affectionate, as though the last 6 months of fear had never happened. "I've been thinking about you." "What do you want, Daniel?" she asked, proud of how steady her own voice sounded. "Just to talk," he said. "Congratulations on the wedding, by the way. Quite the fairy tale, though I have to wonder how much of it is real." "It's real enough," Lena said. "Real enough that you need to stop contacting me." Daniel laughed softly, the sound sending old, familiar chills through her despite herself. "You know, it's funny, I did some research after the wedding announcement. Interesting things about your mother's side of the family. I'm surprised you never mentioned any of it, back when we were together." Lena's grip tightened on the phone, but she forced her voice to remain level. "You knew before I did." "I had suspicions," Daniel admitted, no shame in his voice at all. "Which is precisely why I was so patient with you for so long, Lena. I saw potential in you long before your new husband ever did." The words landed like a slap, confirming everything Ronan's legal team had already uncovered. Everything Victor Sinclair had implied with such calculated cruelty at that dinner. 2 years of manipulation, disguised as love, built entirely on the calculated hope of assets Lena had not even known existed. "You never loved me," she said quietly, the realization settling fully into place, even as she spoke it aloud. "I loved what you could become," Daniel said, as though the distinction should have been comforting. "Your husband will learn the same lesson eventually. Everyone in that world only wants something, Lena. At least I was patient enough to wait." "I'm hanging up now," Lena said, her voice hardening. "Before you do," Daniel said quickly, "you should know that Victor Sinclair and I have come to an arrangement of our own. He wants your husband's board seat weakened. I want what should have been mine years ago. Between the two of us, I suspect your happy little marriage won't survive the month." The call ended before Lena could respond, and she set the phone down slowly, her hands trembling now not from fear but from a cold, clarifying anger she had not allowed herself to feel in months. "They're working together," she said, looking up at Ronan, who had gone very still across the table. "Daniel and Victor," he as good as admitted it. Ronan's jaw tightened, calculation moving swiftly behind his eyes. That explains the timing of Victor's questions at dinner. He wasn't simply probing for weakness, he was coordinating. "What do they want?" Lena asked, though she suspected she already knew. "Victor wants my board seat destabilized enough that shareholders lose confidence in my leadership," Ronan said. "Daniel wants the Whitmore assets, and likely some form of revenge against you for finally escaping him. Together, they have far more resources to cause damage than either would have alone." Over the following days, the coordinated attack revealed itself with unsettling precision. A financial journalist Lena had never heard of published a story questioning the sudden nature of the Cole marriage, citing anonymous sources who suggested the entire relationship had been staged for corporate advantage. Board members who had previously supported Ronan without hesitation began asking pointed questions during meetings, their confidence visibly shaken by the growing rumors swirling through the business press. Then came the video. Sophie brought it to Ronan's attention late one evening, her expression grim as she set a tablet down on his desk. The screen paused on a blurry, poorly lit clip that had begun circulating rapidly across social media. It showed Lena, from months before the wedding, sitting across from a man in a dim restaurant, deep in what appeared to be an intimate conversation, her hand resting briefly on his arm. "That's my cousin, Nathan," Lena said immediately, staring at the screen in disbelief. "That dinner happened weeks before I ever met you. We were discussing a family matter." "The video has been edited," Sophie said grimly, gesturing toward a timestamp visibly altered near the corner of the frame. "Someone wants it to look recent. Wants it to look like evidence of infidelity." "Daniel," Ronan said flatly, his voice carrying a controlled fury Lena had not yet witnessed from him. "He's had access to old photos and footage from before you left him. This has his fingerprints all over it." The story spread faster than any of them anticipated, financial blogs and gossip columns alike seizing on the scandal with gleeful speed, painting Lena as a calculating opportunist who had married Ronan Cole purely for money, while secretly continuing an affair on the side. Board members who had been wavering suddenly found ammunition to push harder against Ronan's leadership, questioning his judgment publicly for the first time in years. Lena watched the narrative spiral out of control, with a growing, sickening sense of helplessness. Old patterns of shame and self-doubt threatening to swallow her whole, despite knowing, with absolute certainty, that the story was a lie. "I should walk away," she said quietly one evening, watching another news segment discuss the scandal with barely concealed relish. "Before this destroys everything you've built." "No," Ronan said immediately, sharper than she had ever heard him. "That's exactly what they want. If you walk away now, it confirms every lie they've constructed. And if I stay, your board loses confidence in you entirely," Lena said, frustration and old fear tangling together in her chest. "I won't be the reason your company falls apart, Ronan. I've spent enough of my life being someone else's excuse for failure." "You are not my excuse for anything," Ronan said, crossing the room to stand directly in front of her, his hands settling firmly on her shoulders, forcing her to meet his eyes. "You are the first honest thing that has happened to me in years, and I refuse to let two bitter, small-minded men convince either of us otherwise." Lena searched his face, looking for hesitation, for the calculated distance he had once used to keep every relationship at arm's length, and found none of it. Only steady, unwavering certainty. "Then what do we do?" she asked quietly. Ronan's expression sharpened, the same focused intensity he brought to every business decision now turned fully toward protecting what had grown between them. "We expose them," he said. "Both of them, publicly, thoroughly, and before they have any further opportunity to cause damage." His eyes held hers, steady and resolute. "I have people already tracing the origin of that video. Once we have proof, we take it directly to the press, to the board, and to anyone else who dared question your integrity." "And if it doesn't work?" Lena asked. Ronan reached up, brushing a stray tear from her cheek that she had not even realized had fallen, his touch gentle, despite the fire burning behind his eyes. "It will work," he said quietly, "because for the first time in my life, I am not fighting for the company, I am fighting for you, and I have never once lost a fight I was willing to give everything for." The investigation moved quickly once Ronan committed his full resources to it. Within 3 days, his security team had traced the doctored video back to a small editing firm that had received payment from an account linked, through several careful layers of shell companies, directly to Daniel Voss. Sophie laid the evidence out across the desk with quiet satisfaction, digital footprints and financial records assembled into an undeniable timeline. "There's more," Sophie added, sliding another folder forward. "Victor Sinclair's fingerprints are all over the timing of the board's sudden confidence crisis. Several of the anonymous sources quoted in that financial story trace back to consultants who have worked exclusively for Sinclair Holdings over the past 2 years." Ronan studied the evidence in silence, his expression carved from stone, before finally looking up at Lena, who stood beside the desk with her arms crossed, watching the pieces of her nightmare finally assemble into something they could fight against directly. "We take this to the press conference tomorrow," Ronan said. "All of it. The board meeting is at the same time," Sophie reminded him gently. "Then we make sure both audiences hear it together," Ronan said, already reaching for his phone, calling in favors and arranging logistics with the same relentless efficiency he brought to every crisis his company had ever faced. The following afternoon, the press conference was arranged in the main lobby of the Cole building, a room usually reserved for product announcements and shareholder updates now filled with journalists, eager for the next chapter of what had become the city's favorite scandal. Board members sat in the front row, arms crossed, expressions skeptical, waiting to see whether their CEO could salvage what remained of his credibility. Lena stood just off to the side, her heart pounding, watching Ronan step up to the podium with the same unshakable composure he brought to every negotiation, though she could see the tension in the set of his shoulders, the weight of everything riding on the next several minutes. 3 weeks ago, Ronan began, his voice carrying easily across the silent room, "I married Lena Hart. Since then, this company and this city have been fed a carefully constructed lie, designed to destabilize both my leadership and my wife's reputation." He paused, letting the words settle before continuing. "Today, I'm going to show you exactly who constructed that lie, and exactly why." He gestured, and a large screen behind him displayed the doctored video alongside the original, unaltered footage, timestamps clearly visible, proving beyond doubt that the supposed affair had been recorded months before the wedding and manipulated to appear recent. Gasps rippled through the assembled press as the deception became undeniable. "This video was commissioned and paid for by Daniel Voss," Ronan continued, displaying the financial records Sophie had uncovered, shell companies and payment trails laid bare for every camera in the room to capture. "A man my wife had the courage to leave, months before I ever met her, after enduring a relationship built on manipulation and control." Murmurs spread through the crowd, journalists scrambling to capture every word, cameras flashing rapidly as the story shifted entirely beneath their feet. "And this," Ronan said, pulling up the second set of documents, "traces the coordinated campaign against my leadership, directly back to Victor Sinclair, who partnered with Mr. Voss in an attempt to destabilize this company's board, while simultaneously punishing a woman for the simple act of leaving a relationship that never deserved her loyalty." The board members in the front row exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier skepticism visibly crumbling under the weight of undeniable evidence. Ronan let the silence stretch for a long moment before delivering his final point, his eyes finding Lena's across the room, steady and certain. "I did not marry Lena Hart for strategic advantage," he said, his voice dropping into something quieter, more personal, than anything the assembled press had likely ever heard from him. "I married her because in the span of a single evening, she showed more courage, facing down real danger, than most people in this room will ever be asked to summon in their entire lives. Everything that has happened since has only confirmed what I suspected that first night. She is not a liability to this company. She is the reason I remember why building something worthwhile matters at all." The room fell silent, cameras still flashing, but the energy had shifted entirely. Skepticism, replaced by something closer to stunned respect. Lena felt tears prick at her eyes, unable to look away from him, from the raw honesty in his voice that no calculated business strategy could have manufactured. The board meeting that followed proceeded far more smoothly than anyone had anticipated, the earlier doubts entirely dissolved by the undeniable evidence and Ronan's unwavering public defense. Within days, the financial press pivoted entirely, running stories not about a manufactured scandal, but about the calculated cruelty of the men who had orchestrated it. Daniel Voss found himself facing serious legal consequences. The fraudulent video and the harassment charges Lena finally felt safe enough to file compounding quickly into a case even his family's resources could not easily dismiss. Victor Sinclair's attempted board takeover collapsed entirely, several of his own investors withdrawing support once his coordination with Daniel became public knowledge. That evening, once the chaos had finally settled into something resembling calm, Lena found Ronan standing alone on the penthouse terrace. City lights spread out beneath him like scattered stars, the same view she had once stumbled over in the dark weeks before. "You didn't have to say all of that today," she said quietly, joining him at the railing. Yes, Ronan said, turning to face her fully. I did. Why? He reached out, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear, with a gentleness that had become achingly familiar over the past weeks. Because somewhere between a stranger grabbing my arm at a gala and standing in front of cameras today, I stopped thinking of you as an arrangement, he said. I started thinking of you as the only thing in my life I actually wanted to keep. Lena's breath caught, the weight of everything they had survived together, settling into something warmer, steadier than she had ever expected to feel again after everything Daniel had taken from her. The contract still says 30 days, she said softly, testing the words, watching his reaction carefully. Contracts can be renegotiated, Ronan said, a rare, genuine smile touching his mouth. I happen to know an excellent lawyer. Lena laughed, the sound surprising her with how light it felt after weeks of fear and tension. And when Ronan leaned down to kiss her again, slow and certain beneath the city lights, she found herself finally believing, for the first time since that desperate whispered plea at the gala, that she had not simply escaped one danger, only to find another. She had found, entirely by accident, exactly where she was meant to be. The court proceedings against Daniel Voss began 3 weeks later, and Lena insisted on attending every session, despite Ronan's gentle suggestion that she could let the lawyers handle it, without subjecting herself to the ordeal. She needed to see it through herself, needed to sit in that courtroom and watch the man who had once made her feel small, finally face consequences for every calculated cruelty he had inflicted. Daniel's lawyers attempted several strategies to minimize the charges, painting the harassment as misunderstood affection and the doctored video as an unfortunate error, rather than deliberate fraud. But the evidence Sophie's team had assembled proved too thorough to dismantle. Financial records, message histories, and testimony from the editing firm that had created the fraudulent footage all painted an undeniable picture of premeditated manipulation. When Lena finally took the stand herself, her voice trembled only slightly as she described 2 years of careful, calculated control disguised as devotion, the isolation from friends, the constant monitoring, the subtle threats wrapped in loving language that had left her doubting her own judgment for months after finally leaving. Ronan sat in the gallery throughout her entire testimony, his presence steady and grounding even from a distance, and when she finally stepped down from the stand, she felt lighter than she had in years, as though speaking the truth aloud had finally loosened a weight she had carried silently for far too long. The judge's ruling came down firmly against Daniel, financial penalties and a restraining order accompanying a formal conviction that effectively ended whatever remained of his standing among the social circles he had once moved through so confidently. Victor Sinclair, facing his own mounting legal troubles related to corporate interference, quietly sold his remaining shares in Sinclair Holdings and disappeared from the city's business scene entirely within the month, his reputation too damaged to recover from the scandal he had helped orchestrate. With both threats finally neutralized, Lena found herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, without fear shadowing every decision she made. She began sleeping through the night without waking at every unfamiliar sound. She stopped glancing over her shoulder on her morning walks through the building's private garden. Slowly, cautiously, she allowed herself to imagine a future that did not revolve entirely around survival. It was during this quieter period that Ronan suggested, almost hesitantly for a man who rarely hesitated over anything, that she meet his father. You don't have to, he added quickly, watching her reaction carefully. He's difficult, cold, in ways that make even me look warm by comparison. I only thought, given everything else you've faced this year, you deserve to understand exactly where the parts of me that struggle with trust actually came from. They drove 2 hours outside the city to a sprawling estate that felt more like a monument than a home, all sharp angles and imposing stone, entirely devoid of the warmth Clara had managed to bring into Ronan's own penthouse despite its size. Ronan's father, Marcus Cole, greeted them in a study lined with framed accolades and business awards, his handshake firm, his eyes assessing Lena with the same calculating precision she had first seen in his son the night of the gala, though without any of the warmth that had slowly emerged beneath Ronan's careful exterior. So you're the wife, Marcus said, without preamble, the one who's caused quite the stir in the financial press these past weeks. I'm the woman your son married, Lena said evenly, refusing to shrink beneath his scrutiny, the way old habits urged her to. Whatever the press decided to make of it afterward wasn't something either of us controlled. Something flickered across Marcus's face, surprise perhaps, or grudging respect, before he gestured toward the chairs across from his desk. The conversation that followed was stiff, transactional, entirely focused on questions about Lena's background and intentions that made it clear exactly where Ronan had learned to approach every relationship as a calculated risk, rather than something worth trusting freely. But as they drove back toward the city that evening, Ronan reached across the console and took her hand, something loosening in his shoulders now that the visit was behind them. He asked about you specifically, because he wanted to find a weakness to exploit, Ronan said quietly. I could see it in every question, and you gave him nothing. I've had enough practice defending myself against men who think they're entitled to my life, Lena said, though her voice carried no bitterness, only the quiet strength of someone who had finally learned her own worth. Your father doesn't scare me nearly as much as he probably scared you growing up. Ronan was silent for a long moment, watching the city lights grow closer through the windshield. I used to think love was something you negotiated for, like everything else in my life, he said finally. A transaction, carefully weighed, always with an exit strategy in mind. He glanced over at her, something vulnerable in his expression that she had rarely seen outside their most private moments together. I don't think that anymore. What changed? Lena asked softly. You did, Ronan said simply. Somewhere between the gala and the court proceedings and every quiet morning in between, I stopped calculating the risk of loving you and started simply doing it instead. Lena's chest tightened with warmth, the kind she had once been certain she would never trust herself to feel again, after everything Daniel had taken from her. She squeezed his hand gently, watching the city grow larger ahead of them, the glass towers glittering against the darkening sky, like something out of a life she never could have imagined for herself. I think, she said quietly, that I stopped calculating too. Neither of them said anything further for the rest of the drive, the silence between them comfortable now, in a way it had never quite managed to be during those first uncertain weeks of their arrangement. Two people who had entered a contract out of necessity, slowly discovering they had built, almost without meaning to, something neither of them was willing to let expire. The 30 days outlined in their original contract came and went without either of them mentioning it once, the deadline dissolving quietly beneath the weight of everything they had built together in its place. Sophie, ever practical, brought up the expired paperwork during a routine check-in one afternoon, only to be waved off by Ronan with a distracted shrug that told her everything she needed to know about where things actually stood, between her employer and the woman the entire city now recognized as far more than a strategic arrangement. Lena had settled fully into the penthouse by then, not as a temporary guest occupying the East Wing, but as someone who had rearranged the bookshelves to include her own favorites, who had convinced Clara to let her help in the kitchen on quiet Sunday mornings, who no longer flinched at unfamiliar sounds or unexpected phone calls. The Whitmore inheritance had been formally claimed and secured under careful legal protections. The properties eventually sold off, with the proceeds placed into a foundation Lena established herself, funding support services for others escaping controlling relationships, a decision that had surprised even Ronan with its quiet determination. It was on an ordinary Tuesday evening, nothing about the day marked as special in any way, that Ronan came home earlier than usual, Sophie's absence from his side signaling something had shifted in his routine. Lena was curled on the sitting room sofa with a book when he appeared in the doorway, his jacket already discarded, an unfamiliar nervousness in his posture that she had never once seen from him, not even during the height of the scandal months before. You're home early, she said, setting the book aside, studying him carefully. I need to ask you something, Ronan said, and for a man who had once negotiated multi-million-dollar mergers without a flicker of hesitation, his voice carried an uncertainty that immediately caught her full attention. That sounds serious, Lena said, rising from the sofa, a nervous flutter beginning in her own chest, despite not yet knowing what he intended to say. Ronan crossed the room slowly, reaching into his jacket pocket and withdrawing a small velvet box that made Lena's breath catch entirely. He did not kneel, not immediately, instead studying her face for a long moment, as though committing every detail of it to memory. We got married in a rush, he said quietly. A contract, a deadline, a business strategy, dressed up in vows neither of us meant at the time. You never had a real proposal. You never had a ring chosen, because I wanted you to have it, rather than because a lawyer required a wedding band for the paperwork to look convincing. Lena's eyes filled with unexpected tears, watching him finally lower himself onto one knee, the velvet box opening to reveal a ring, far simpler and more elegant than she would have expected from a man of his wealth, clearly chosen with care, rather than ostentation. "I know we're already married," Ronan continued, his voice steady now despite the vulnerability in his eyes, "but I wanted to ask you properly, the way I should have from the very beginning, if you had come to me freely, instead of out of desperation that night. Lena Hart, will you stay married to me, not because a contract requires it, not because either of us needs protection from anyone anymore, but because I cannot imagine building the rest of my life with anyone else beside me?" Lena's tears spilled over freely now, a laugh escaping alongside them. Disbelief and joy tangled together in equal measure. "Yes," she said, barely able to get the word out clearly. "Ronan, yes." He slid the ring onto her finger, with hands that trembled slightly, an unfamiliar sight from a man who had built his entire reputation on unshakable composure, and when he rose to pull her into his arms, Lena felt the last remnants of her old fear dissolve completely, replaced by a certainty she had never once expected to feel again after everything Daniel had cost her. "I love you," Ronan said quietly against her hair, the words simple and unguarded, in a way that felt more valuable than any grand declaration he might have made in front of cameras months before. "I love you too," Lena answered, and meant it completely, the truth of it settling into her chest, with a warmth that no calculated strategy could have ever manufactured. They stood together on the terrace long after the proposal, the same terrace where she had once twisted her ankle in the dark, the same terrace where Ronan had first admitted their arrangement had stopped feeling like a contract, city lights spreading endlessly beneath them, like a promise neither of them fully understood yet, but both were finally ready to trust. "We should have a real wedding," Lena said eventually, resting her head against his shoulder. "Something small, something that actually feels like ours, rather than something arranged in 3 days to satisfy a board meeting." "Whatever you want," Ronan said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "I believe I've learned by now that arguing with you rarely ends in my favor." Lena laughed softly, the sound carrying easily into the quiet night air, and for the first time since that desperate whisper at the gala months before, she found herself looking forward to a future entirely free of fear, built instead on something she had once believed impossible to trust again. A love chosen freely, without contracts or deadlines, simply because two people had found something worth keeping in each other, despite every obstacle placed deliberately in their path. The second wedding took place on a quiet stretch of coastline, 3 hours outside the city, far removed from board meetings and financial press, and anyone with an interest in turning the occasion into another headline. Clara had insisted on overseeing every detail personally, refusing to let anyone else arrange flowers for the woman she had come to think of as family over the past several months, and Sophie, for once entirely off duty, sat in the small gathering of guests with an uncharacteristically wide smile on her face. Lena stood at the edge of the shoreline, in a simple white dress, nothing like the hastily arranged gown from their first ceremony, this one chosen carefully over several unhurried weeks, exactly the way she had once imagined a wedding might feel, before Daniel Voss had convinced her such moments were reserved for other, luckier women. The late afternoon sun cast a warm golden light across the water, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt entirely present in her own life, unburdened by fear, unshadowed by anyone else's calculated agenda. Ronan waited for her beneath a simple arch decorated with flowers Clara had chosen, specifically because Lena had once mentioned, in an offhand comment months before, that she had always loved them as a child. He wore no tie. His usual careful armor of tailored suits softened into something more relaxed, more himself, and when Lena reached him, he took her hands with a gentleness that made the small gathering of guests fall completely silent. "Last time," Ronan said quietly, just for her, "I promised you protection, and 30 days. This time, I only have one promise left to make." "What's that?" Lena asked, her voice thick with emotion she no longer bothered hiding. "Forever," he said simply. "However long that turns out to be." Lena laughed softly through her tears, the memory of their very first conversation rising unbidden, her own desperate whisper at the gala so many months before, his quiet, confident response that had changed the entire trajectory of her life. "Marry me for one day," she had begged him, terrified and searching for any escape at all. Forever sounds better, he had told her then, and she had not fully understood, in that moment, exactly how true those words would eventually become. They exchanged vows, as the sun began its slow descent toward the water. Promises spoken freely this time, chosen rather than required, each word carrying the weight of everything they had survived together, to arrive at this quiet, unremarkable stretch of coastline that had somehow become the most important place either of them had ever stood. When Ronan finally kissed her as her husband for the second time, the applause from their small gathering of guests carried out across the water, warm and genuine, in a way the polished ballroom of their first wedding had never quite managed to feel. In the months that followed, Lena's foundation grew steadily, offering support and resources to others rebuilding their lives after controlling relationships, work that gave her a sense of purpose entirely separate from the Cole name, though Ronan supported every initiative with the same quiet, unwavering dedication he brought to everything that mattered to him. Daniel Voss, stripped of his family's patience and increasingly isolated by his own legal troubles, eventually left the city entirely, a distant, diminished figure who no longer held any power over the woman he had once tried so hard to control. Victor Sinclair's name faded from business circles almost entirely within the year, a cautionary tale whispered occasionally among executives about the dangers of underestimating exactly who a person might become, once free of the fear that had once held them back. Ronan's board, initially so quick to doubt him during the height of the manufactured scandal, came to regard the marriage as one of the company's greatest unexpected strengths, a partnership that had weathered genuine crisis and emerged stronger for it, a stability no calculated public relations strategy could have ever manufactured on its own. On quiet evenings, when the city lights spread out beneath their terrace exactly as they had on that very first night Lena moved into the penthouse, Ronan would sometimes reach for her hand without a word, a simple gesture that had become their own private language, gratitude and love, intertwined, in a silence far more meaningful than any grand declaration could have captured. "Do you ever think about that night at the gala?" Lena asked him once, months into their second, truer marriage, watching the sunset paint the sky in soft shades of gold and orange. "Every day," Ronan admitted, pulling her closer against his side. "I think about how close I came to simply enjoying my drink by that window and letting the moment pass me by entirely." "What made you say yes?" Lena asked, though she had asked some version of the question before, curious to see if his answer would ever change. Ronan considered it carefully, the way he considered everything, before answering with the same simple honesty that had first drawn her to trust him, despite every instinct warning her against it. "You looked at me like I was your last option," he said quietly, "but you never once looked like you were giving up. I'd spent my entire life surrounded by people who gave up the moment things became difficult. I wanted to know what it looked like to keep fighting anyway." Lena smiled, resting her head against his shoulder, watching the last light of day disappear slowly beyond the horizon. She had walked into that gala terrified, searching desperately for any escape from a life that had nearly convinced her she deserved nothing better than fear and control. She had found, instead, entirely by accident, a man who had taught her that love did not have to be a transaction, that safety did not have to come at the cost of her own freedom, and that sometimes the most desperate whispered lies could become, against every possible expectation, the truest promise either of them had ever made. Forever, it turned out, really did sound better. And for Lena Hart, who had once believed she would spend the rest of her life running from fear, forever finally felt like exactly the kind of ending she deserved.